So I know you guys, I can write your resume, but tell me about you two guys.
We're from R2 Engineering out of Lubbock.
R&M Engineering.
R2.
R2 out of Lubbock.
Do civil engineering, safety, and environmental.
Civil engineering, safety, and environmental. And what kind of background do you guys have before you got into consulting?
We're the safety guys.
You're the safety end. And always in the consulting world or in industry before?
Industry and state consulting.
So, a lot of, okay. Well, we're not going to talk a lot about safety, except that we do a fair amount of safety, but not in the oil and gas industry at all. Our safety work is in other industries completely. We do this, we're going to talk about stormwater, and specifically what brought me here today is the stuff that's going on in Odessa. Okay? Odessa decided they had a mayor. They got somebody elected a few months ago or a year ago or so, and he ran on the campaign that he was going to clean up the city. And then the first thing he did was he went out and hired somebody to start up an environmental compliance type group within the city and administer the state stormwater program. And he has sort of expanded his scope of work a little bit as time goes on. And it's an interesting thing. The first time that I ever got involved in environmental, the very first time, was when we were dealing with the thing that we all know as the Valdez, and a ship ran aground, spilled a bunch of oil up in Alaska. There was all of this sort of stuff going on about what do we do about oil cleanups and how do we protect the environment from oil releases. At the same time, there was a big tank in, I don't remember if it was in, I think it was in Pennsylvania, but it was with Ashland Chemical, and it ruptured on the side of a hill, and it dropped 1 million gallons of fuel oil into the Monongahela River, which immediately ran down into the Ohio River. And there was all of this uproar about what are we going to do about these cleanups and how do we prevent them from happening. Well, I know from experience that the Permian Basin is just now somewhat coming into that. Texas is not, and I currently work in 46 states, so sometimes I think I'm a little bit, I do have a little bit of experience to be able to say some things. Texas is not progressive about environmental compliance. It's one of the least progressive environmental compliance states there are in the 50 states. And surprisingly, more progressive is Louisiana, and I would never think of Louisiana as being able to outpace us in Texas. History-wise, I did spend a lot of time in General Electric. I did manage federal Superfund sites in my days, and then one day I decided, well, I'm not at General Electric, and I'm going to have to make a living, and I've got to support my family and that kind of stuff. How am I going to do it? And I started James Environmental Management. And like all good small companies, we starved to death for a few years, okay? And then all of a sudden, something happened in 1995, and it was a new program that really wasn't new, but it was new in 1995. And that was the MSGP, the Multi-Sector Stormwater Permit Program for how we manage surface water runoffs in the country. And what had happened was, going back in time, the Clean Water Act was passed originally to clean up the waterways of the country, and they decided they're going to go after point source discharges. So the pipes coming out of the back of the factory that go straight to the river. We always, in America, always put our factories on rivers because you needed a place to put the waste product. You had to get rid of the waste product, and you didn't pay a truck driver to take it somewhere. You opened a valve and put it in the river and let it go to the ocean. And this is the way the world worked up until the early 70s, up until places like in Cleveland, or outside of Cleveland, when the Cuyahoga River caught on fire, when the Chicago River caught on fire. And that was because there was more oil in the rivers and more hazardous materials than there was actually water. So all of those things started making everybody change. Then we had all of these things come about, they forced change, and then they realized that the rivers weren't necessarily getting any cleaner, even though they cleaned up industry. And industry got pretty clean as a whole. So then they started looking at something called non-point source discharge, which is stormwater. And you know, there's been a lot of progress taking place. And if you're going to work in the stormwater compliance world, my philosophy for the 20 years that we had our company, my philosophy was you need to work where it rains and where there's water. And that would not normally include the Permian Basin. Even though I was born in Andrews, I have lived all over the Permian Basin. I lived in Midland for 9 years, but it doesn't, you don't think of this place, even though maybe it rained some last night, I don't know, I was asleep. But you don't think of it as raining here, and you don't think of stormwater pollution. But then you've got things that become issues, and these are the waterways that we deal with. And believe it or not, Monahan's Draw is a waterway that's worth taking care of. So Monahan's Draw drains most of this part of the country. I do a lot of work in Phoenix, a lot of stormwater work. And we've got a protected river called the Salt River, and it runs right through the center of Phoenix. And the area where every one of my customers discharge to, that river is bone dry for 18, 24 months a year, except during the monsoon seasons. And that's what they call them in Arizona, as a monsoon. So, but that water, there is some endangered species in the bottom of that sand, and that changes the whole way that we deal with stormwater in that particular part of the river. Well, we're now doing that in Odessa with the Monahan's Draw. And we're doing it because of the politics of how the city has worked. Okay, this started out as a political thing, but from a regulatory standpoint, the city is standing on solid ground. Okay? So you guys are working in this arena, you guys are working in this arena. There's a lot of stuff going on over there, and here's been my experience in dealing with the city of Odessa. I will go back to you and say that just yesterday, I was selected to serve as an expert witness on a huge issue up on Long Island, having to do with surface water, having to do with a town, and having to do with some businesses. So, Odessa's not new to me, but it's new the way the city is approaching stormwater compliance. Because have y'all interacted with Jason?
Yes.
Yeah, well, Jason has an interesting approach to how to deal with stormwater compliance. And I'm saying that in the politest of all manners. He has an interesting approach. So let's take off here. So now we've gone back in history. We look back and we just look down at what's happened and what brought us to where we are today. Okay? Now, I wish the people that the regulated side of the business, I wish they were in here, because they're the ones that need to be here. These are things that all of us in this room know about and deal with on a regular basis. The biggest thing that's happening is that we've got a situation now where we're regulated in Texas by TCEQ. Now that's, from an overall compliance standpoint, that's easy for the regulated community because TCEQ does not enforce stormwater rules very much. And usually the times when I've found that they enforce the stormwater rules, it's because the EPA has beat them over the head with a 2x4. And there's this running battle, has been for the 20 years I've been back in Texas, between EPA and TCEQ. Okay, and that's not ever going to change. But this is who our permit is from, is TCEQ. Click. This is the clicker over here. So, we talk about federal, state, and local. We deal with something called an MS4. We deal with something called Phase 2 of the Stormwater Permit Program, where all of a sudden a bunch of these cities have been told that they are in charge of the stormwater program for their particular state. Now, I've interacted with the city of Midland, they've chosen not to. They're challenged, they're tasked with performing these types of programs or administering these, but they've chosen not to administer them unless there's a complaint. Okay? I can't believe that, you know, I did live in Midland for 9 years, and I do know the competitive nature between Midland and Odessa. I can't believe that at the end of the day, the city of Midland is going to let the city of Odessa get ahead of it on overall environmental social behavior. Because
I don't think it'll lie.
yeah, I think that Midland one day will look up and say, wait a minute, Odessa's doing the right thing. They may not be going about it the way we would like, but they're doing the right thing. So then Midland is going to say, wait a minute, we're not going to let them get ahead of us. It's been my experience. I write and comment and have had influence on many of the stormwater regulations in the country. And I promise you, when something happens in one state, the next door state absolutely is going to catch up. We're seeing it right now on all of the states around the Chesapeake Bay. Every state, Maryland finally realized that Virginia was way ahead of it, and Delaware was way ahead. So Maryland has decided to start catching up. And when they decided to catch up, it's been painful. Okay, so we've got the states. Now then we're going to talk about this one. This is an issue that you don't get to say, well, the water doesn't run off my place, so therefore I take care of the water and I've got a really clean operation, so therefore I don't need a stormwater permit. That's not the option that's given to the facility owner. The rules associated with oil and gas industry, clearly the oil and gas industry has the best lobbying group in the whole United States. Clearly. And that's a good thing. And if you're sitting in the oil and gas business, that's a great thing. But it makes it complicated about who needs a stormwater permit and who does not. Okay? The whole drilling operation is, the drilling activity, almost every bit of it is exempted from the stormwater program. Most of the service businesses are exempted from the stormwater program. What makes the service businesses, though, trip up is when they're doing some processing type activity. You know, if you think about it in a very simplified manner, if you've got a pipe yard and you bring pipe in and you set it on the pipe yard, and then you load it up on a truck and you ship it out to some site somewhere, that pipe yard does not need a stormwater plan or a stormwater permit. But if you bring that pipe in, we work for Permian Enterprises. Permian Enterprises processes a lot of pipe. They line it with concrete. They line it with different materials. They do a lot of cutting and threading and that kind of stuff. Those activities trigger a requirement for the stormwater program. So you have to come back and look at those really easily. But many of the oil service industries do not require stormwater compliance activities. Okay? Now, I say that as long as you're not in the city of Odessa. Being in Odessa changes the picture a little bit. All right, so we're also going to talk a little bit. Most of the stormwater rules are regulated by something called an SIC code. I would think that all of us know what an SIC code is. Most of the stormwater rules are regulated. There is an action where it gets interpreted this way a lot, frequently, including in Texas. If it looks like a duck, and it walks like a duck, and it quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck, so therefore it probably needs a stormwater permit. And that happens fairly often. So, we're also going to talk a little bit about SPCCs. There's a lot less exemptions on the SPCC world. Okay, most of the guys out there, most of these big tanks need an SPCC. Okay, click. Downstream waters, that's what this is all about. It's hard. I would say to you that frequently in a conversation like this, I will make a comment. It is hard to apply logic or common sense to some of the environmental rules. it's hard to look at the Monaghan Straw and say that it's a navigable waterway. But under the rules, it does represent a possibility for oil to eventually get there. I do have experience at TI having an equipment operator dump 10,000 gallons of number 2 fuel oil onto the Scarborough Ranch back in the 80s. That was not a good, that was a bad day in my life. It was just a bad day. Yeah. So, looking at things like stormwater, one of the things we deal with in stormwater is a sheen as a reportable release. I hate the idea of calling the government and asking for them to come in and help me. I don't like to have help. If I'm an owner, I don't want help in solving my problem. But a sheen of oil on waterway is a reportable release. Let's go to the next one. All right, stormwater plans. I say to people all the time, everybody overcomplicates this. Now, Tetra Tech may not like me for saying this, but these are the simplest of all documents. And they're not expensive. People out there can buy a stormwater plan for everything but the most complex facility. You know, I've worked at some very large General Electric facilities where the stormwater treatment plant costs $20 million. Those kinds of stormwater plans and programs are not simple. But a typical little facility, you know, $3,000 to $4,000 is a pretty good number for a stormwater plan. And that can include just about everything, and it's straightforward. Stormwater compliance is not about moving dirt. Stormwater compliance is about making sure that you follow the documentation and the reporting and all that kind of stuff. We improve the water quality with something called a best management practice. And I won't go into what a best management practice is, but that's the way we manage it. Now, in other states, and I think that Utah's coming close. I was just in Salt Lake City last week. But if you have a construction project in the state of Washington right now, every construction project has to have active stormwater treatment. Active treatment. Well, they're not talking about, so there's guys making mega dollars. They've got these little skid-mounted stormwater treatment system, and they set it out there and they rent it to you for $400 or $500 a day, and it's working like a dream. This is just a picture. I think this is the Cuyahoga River when it was on fire. This was the start of a lot of the legislation. Everybody in this room I know is younger, including you are. You're younger than I am. But I just gave my friend Brittany a reading assignment. If you want to learn about where environmental law came from, where environmental thought process came from, there's a book that everybody ought to read about environmental. And it's called Silent Spring. And it was written in 1962 by a lady named Rachel Carson. It is just truly a great piece of written material to read. And you understand when all of the birds were getting the split beaks from the DDT that we were spraying to kill the mosquitoes and all that kind of stuff, you understand why they started to ban some of the chemicals they started to ban. Click. All right, just a picture. I thought I was going to get hit. I was going out for a run one morning on the day after this, and one of my good friends in my neighborhood here in Midland, he worked for Exxon. And I wasn't doing as much environmental as I do today, but I walked into the street and I started slandering Exxon in a big way. And he wanted to get physical because I attacked his company. And we had no idea on that morning that it was going to take as long as it did. Okay. Brittany asked me a question about stormwater. She said, well, was the Valdez thing maybe worse than the BP thing? I said, well, you know, there were probably a lot of more gallons of oil spilled by BP, but it was the difference in the ecosystem that they went into. It takes forever for the environment to heal itself in places like Alaska. The Caribbean and the Gulf, I mean, it was bad, and it was truly a disaster, and a lot of people were harmed. But still, it will heal itself in a matter of a few decades or a few years, okay? Click. And we can go to the click to the next one. All right, so let's talk about SPCCs. These are not complicated either, unless you're writing an SPCC for some refinery somewhere, or some really large terminal operation of some type. But the fundamentals, the way an SPCC is developed, it follows a very prescriptive set of standards of how you develop one. There's a key number to remember in an SPCC. This applies to the oil field almost all the time. If there's more than 10,000 gallons associated with it, it's going to require a PE stamp. If there's not 10,000 gallons, then technically anybody out in this hall can write their own SPCC. They don't need an environmental consultant. They don't need an environmental engineer. It doesn't take it. And the rules are spelled out. Now, do I suggest they do that? I tell my customers, you know, if you want to go do this yourself, you can do it. You're allowed to do it. But while you're doing that, you're not doing what makes you money. And so therefore, the reason why you would hire me or hire you guys or hire Tetra Tech would be because you're going to let us do the things that keep you from making money. And we let our customers go out and do that. Granted, we're an overhead cost. So, there's been some recent changes in the SPCC rules. There is right now a major ruling that just came out of EPA on the definition of waters in the U.S. And I'm not so sure it changed a lot, but I'm not so sure any of us really know the end result of that final ruling. It took a number of years for it to come out. And it does make the SPCC, it may bring some common sense to it. Because one of the rules when you're deciding, do I need an SPCC, is whether or not the potential exists from a spill containment for my petroleum product to reach a water of the state. And if that potential exists, then it tells you what rules you got to follow. Well, if you lose 10,000 gallons of oil at a TI plant in Midland, is it possible that that 10,000 gallons is ever going to reach waters of the state? Probably not. Okay, but still, there's some new things that I would say pay attention to. Quick. All right. So we talked about the oil. We talked about Valdez. We talked about Ashland Chemical. But all of those things generated what became the Oil Pollution Act. And out of the Oil Pollution Act, a big thing that was reinforced was this thing called a Spill Prevention and Countermeasures Control Plan. Okay? Remember, under 10,000 gallons does not require PE stamp, does not require that it be done by a professional of any of us. Over 10,000 gallons does, and you really want somebody that understands what they're doing. Right now, we discovered an SPCC we wrote in Binghamton, New York, that we did not stamp. And we wrote it 3 years ago. And the facility is going through a transaction requiring phase ones, and some really good environmental engineer looked at that SPCC and said, where's the PE stamp on this? So it's getting a stamp sometime in the next 2 hours. Okay? It has to go back through the process and be reviewed in Texas and then go back to New York fast. All right. So all of these things have existed forever. Now, I do a lot of writing, and I write about culture and how do we affect these kinds of changes. I was brought up and I was trained by some of the best companies in the world. I spent a lot of time with Texas Instruments. I spent a lot of time with GE. When the underground tank rules came out in 1985, which was part of all of this time frame, there was an edict went out from Dallas to TI, and the whole corporation worldwide, we pulled every underground tank that existed anywhere in a TI facility in 1985. No questions asked. We didn't want to deal with it. And what we've all learned now since 1985, underground tanks leak. It happens. Keeps a lot of environmental remediation companies really busy. All right, so we've talked about the size of these. We've talked about, we're in good shape. Let's go to the next one. All right. These issues, whether they're stormwater or an SPCC, those kinds of things are affecting all of our oil fields everywhere in the U.S. Now, it's probably a little easier to be in Carrizo and do something environmentally than it is to do one out in LA in that old oil field that's right outside of the airport there. Complying with anything to do with the oil industry is going to be difficult in California. There is a big movement right now about something to do with one of the shale plays in Utah that I was listening to the radio last week. And Utah can be an activist kind of community. Let me touch on it. It's not in my talk. But there is something that we deal with around the country, and we don't deal with it in Texas, except, surprisingly, I'm going through an environmental justice lawsuit activity in a little town called Laredo, Texas. Can't imagine that that would ever happen in Laredo. And I've got one in Houston. I can't imagine it in Houston. But at the same time, if you get up in the Northeast, or you get into the West Coast, you deal with a lot of third-party activist type activities. And the Clean Water Act makes that easy for third-party groups to come together. Right now on stormwater, there are two groups. And what it is, it's a team of 4 or 5 or 6 lawyers that come together. They form a company called, one of them is called the Conservation Law Foundation. The other one is called the Clean Water Action Group. And all they do is they sit down and they say, oh, you're supposed to have a stormwater permit. Here's a letter. We think you probably are out of compliance for all of these things. And they just go down through the requirements of the stormwater permit. And they say, we think you're probably out of conditions on all of these. And so you can send us $25,000 or we're going to file, we're giving you notice that we intend to sue. And you can send us $25,000 and we'll go away until next quarter or next year. Then we'll send you another letter. It is what, I work for industry, remember, I don't care if somebody doesn't agree with me, but it's legalized extortion. Because I've had customers put out of business because of this, and they were trying to do their job. So I worry more about the third-party interest groups than I do sometimes about the environmental agencies of a particular region, because we get a lot of neighbors signed up, and it gets pretty expensive pretty fast. It gets expensive in a hurry. So we have these issues whether we're in the Permian Basin. Now, in our case, we're dealing with Odessa. Specifically right now, I'm talking about Odessa. I'm talking about the Permian Basin. Permian Basin is fairly reasonable. Texas is fairly reasonable. Odessa is fairly difficult. There is difficult places within New Mexico, okay? Typically, I find that you get into the most difficult places when you're in an area where there is a very sensitive water ecosystem. The Everglades, Chesapeake Bay, Narragansett Bay, the San Francisco Bay. Those kinds of places, yeah. Sometimes maybe I don't think that way when I think about Monahan Straw. Okay? But maybe I should. Okay, so we've got all of these things. Now, stormwater rules, if you go over here into the Marcellus Shale, and I know the Marcellus goes up into New York, but I think so far the state of New York has prevented any drilling. But let me tell you, environmental compliance, when they cross the state line, I do a lot of work in New York, almost more than Texas. And when they cross the state line into New York, then most of the whole state deals with it about the same way that Odessa does. So it gets to be interesting. And I think the day will come when drilling will be allowed in New York. It'll just take a big fight, but eventually it'll happen. Because the towns in New York are just as depressed as they are in Pennsylvania. Okay? City of Odessa. So I want to focus just specifically about this, and I am being tactful. I really am. But it's a tough environment for a company to try to operate a business that never knew they were supposed to have a stormwater permit, or never knew that they were supposed to have. Because one of the things that I teach and preach is the way for us to do everything we want to do is to do it in a civilized manner. We can talk about these. I know you heard that my master's in civil and environmental engineering is from a place called Tufts University. That's a very liberal part of the world, but you're talking about how to negotiate and how to discuss things in a civilized manner. Yelling and screaming doesn't get it done. Okay? It doesn't make it happen. But I have said in Odessa in the last month, you do not need to threaten me ever again. Threatening me doesn't work. And oh, by the way, this is a publicly traded company that tries to do things right. It's probably a good idea to stop threatening them. Because I advised one of my customers in recent days, I said, if I was still at General Electric and this happened at GE, I know exactly what we would have done at GE. We would have surrounded this whole property with lawyers. And we would have said, now we'll talk. But we don't have to do that. I think we've got it back to a civilized nature. So Odessa, they're on righteous ground. They're saying they're complying with the regulations, maybe a little bit more strenuous than I would like, but they are generally trying to comply with the regulations. But they're approaching it through the use of warrants and entry into facilities. I'm sure that you guys have dealt with this. Entry into facilities sometimes, in a frightening manner. I work for a lot of people that don't have a high school degree. They don't have a diploma. They're afraid. I'm from the government. That means that I'm here to hurt you, And that's not the case. Everybody's out for the same. All of us in this room are out for exactly the same result. And most regulatory agencies are the same result we want. I would like for my kids to have a good place to live and grow up. So we've talked about this. Under this guise of the stormwater program in Odessa, we've experienced a situation where the regulator would like to take soil samples. And it doesn't work that way. It's not right. And we should not take soil samples.
The city is asking to take soil samples?
Oh, they're even taking them themselves.
That's fine.
Yes. No, it's been, there's been times when it's been quite contentious. Why are we taking soil samples when the concern is that we have a stormwater program? Now, the very bottom line in this is the absolute most troubling point in all of this. And that is the city is taking soil samples. Now, I will tell you that they don't understand sampling protocols, and that's good. So someday, if we do end up in a legal fight, the fact that they violated chains of custody and violated sampling methods and those kinds of things, we will use that if we need to. If we can't approach it in a civilized manner, we will. But the facts are that the data still gets reported to the TCEQ. And once it gets into the TCEQ system, then the state is obligated to at least do something with that knowledge. It may take them 10 years to do something, but I'm dealing right now with a client in Odessa, and my advice to him, he's poor. He's not in the oil and gas industry, and he's poor. I think he may be overstating that, but anyway, we're talking about the fact that we need to financially make sure that we're protected, because this could get out of hand, and it could get costly fast. Go ahead.
So I was gonna say my questions for later, but I was gonna, it sounds like the agency on Odessa, the city's you're just saying that they're overstepping their bounds. But to me, you're all saying they're implementing the regs as written, so how are they overstepping their boundaries based, if they're enforcing the state regulatory requirements?
Well, it's interesting, because I've prided myself in, if I ever send you a letter that you have to get out a dictionary to understand what I said, it probably means I'm really pissed. And so we're working exactly that philosophy with the city right now. All right, we are going to comply with the regulations and the ordinances of the city, period, black and white. So now then, if you want me to take samples, then show me in the ordinances where I have to take samples, and we will take them. And that's been our posture for the last month or two, and it's worked pretty well. But you're exactly on target. What they're trying to do, they're trying to say we've got to clean up the stormwater discharges. But they've rolled all of these other subject matters into the TPDES program, okay?
Based on what?
Based on I'm bigger than you are?
It seems like it's one guy who's screaming, who's stomping his foot and saying you're gonna follow.
And stomping the foot is one of the physical reactions.
Stormwater.
It is, but I've also been doing this environmental compliance so long that I know that being in a fight is the last thing you want to do.
Right.
If there is any way at all. I'm a CHL kind of guy, and I carry guns and all that. But what do they teach you when you're going through all that? The last thing you ever want to do is pull a gun. The first thing you want to do is walk away. Turn around and walk away. And that's somewhat the way you approach this. Is we don't need a fight. And remember I said a lot of these people are not as sophisticated as a Select Energy or as a Halliburton or some of those kind of guys. They have a level of sophistication about what it takes to be in compliance that little bitty guys don't have. So somebody comes in and yells and screams a little bit, it scares them. And it makes the job that you and I have and you and I have, it makes our job a little bit tougher. Okay? All right, click. So, what makes Odessa interesting, this is just the most recent city boundary. You can be in the city here, but not in the city there. You can be, there's one street in particular, I forget where it is. It's over near Pearl Road, you know where Civils is and that kind of stuff right on the south side of the railroad. Well, there's one of those streets running down through there where one side of the street is in the city limits and the other side is not. But the city's interpretation in Odessa is that if your stormwater discharge flows across property of the city, then you have to comply with these rules, even if you're not in the city. Now, that's their interpretation. They're actually right. Because what they're enforcing is a state rule. Everybody in the state of Texas that falls in those industrial classifications has to have a stormwater permit and has to have a stormwater plan, and they're supposed to comply. Let me tell you what probably a high number for who's in compliance with stormwater in the state of Texas. Max 20%. And it's worse in the West than it is and if you're in Houston, if you're in Harris County, both the city and the county have really, really good environmental compliance organizations. Really good. So it makes it difficult to figure out, well, being a consultant and being a foreigner, you know, coming into Odessa and saying, well, where is the city limits? That's important to me. When I finally figured out how to figure it out. One thing Odessa has really good, they do a great job of using ArcGIS mapping and that kind of stuff. And they've got some really good GIS maps of every kind of service they have. And it's all in public domain. Clear? All right, risk. You know, I don't see very many of those $37,500 per day violations, and I absolutely deplore doing things because I'm threatened or the fear tactic. And I don't, our company doesn't, we don't use fear as a marketing tool. We're going to do it because it's the right thing. I got to tell you, if you never filed another tax return in your life, you'd probably be okay and nobody would ever know. But the reason why you file it is because you know it's the right thing to do. Inability to obtain license. Our friends in Odessa have actually held hostage a building permit for a facility that was growing because there was a debate over their stormwater permit. So we got around that. These are tough negotiations that you know, I would expect this when you're dealing with a RCRA corrective action project or a Superfund cleanup. I would expect those kinds of things. But I wouldn't expect it over a little stormwater permit. Last one, inability to secure contracts. BP. If you want to do business with BP, you have to demonstrate that you meet the requirements of OSHA, you meet the requirements of certain environmental issues. Many power companies, if you want to do business with them, you have to assure that you comply. So this becomes the biggest leverage, okay, that we can show that we're complying. Click. All right, just a little bit of the next two slides after this one are more of a, I'll go through them very fast because they're more blatant marketing type deals. But this compliance with stormwater, compliance with SPCCs is simple. It is not complicated, it is not expensive. And if I was in a downturning industry, right now would be the time for me to start trying to clean up my house, because when things are blowing and going as fast as they have the last few years, it's impossible to keep all this stuff in your head. But now's the time to get it all cleaned up. Next, one of the things that we're seeing happening in our marketplaces is that everything is going to online reporting. Everything. We're going to end up with all reporting, all applications, all permits, everything will go electronic. And so we're scrambling as fast as we can. How do you submit a discharge monitoring report electronically? And how do you do it and meet all of the legal requirements for who can sign? So we've rolled out something that we call e-comply to help us to manage that for our 1,000+ customers around the U.S. in all industries, including in this industry. We've done it for both environmental and safety, but in the oil and gas industry, we have made a decision we are not going to provide safety services, just because we think there's so many great companies already in that market. It doesn't make sense for us to go try to knock heads and compete. The one thing that we think about compliance, it comes about with I can write a stormwater plan for you, but if you and I don't work together, you'll be out of compliance in a week. So it takes a little bit of both of us, and it doesn't matter if you're using Tetra Tech or James Environmental or you guys, it doesn't matter. The same thing happens. So the big thing that we try to promote is that it takes a little bit of whoever your professional help is. You know, if it's fiscal due diligence and you're using Ernst & Young, you know, you got to work with them. Click. I will stop there. Questions, comments? Pretty straightforward stuff. Pretty fun.
About the only thing I heard of from the Odessa, because we don't have very much environmental activity going on in the Odessa area, was just a letter from the city requesting analytical. I think that was the first phase of requiring or requesting information.
And they've done that, and that's probably one of the better approaches to that I've seen. Most states don't realize, or most cities don't realize, they're supposed to have that information. And that just is a gentle prompting. You know, you're supposed to be taking rainwater samples. Send me the data. Now, granted, they're finding out the guy says, what do you mean I'm supposed to take it? But at least then they got a friendly reminder. Okay? The one thing that I will say about this enforcement inspector in Odessa, he's very smart. And he's very, very good with how to manage data. And he's doing some things with the data that he's accumulating that if you just put your pure intellectual hat on, it's pretty damn good. It's pretty good. Maybe tough for us to work with, but it's pretty good. If I could get him to do one thing, and that's stop this relationship between stormwater and soil. I know that the water runs across the soil. I mean, I'm not new to this, but still the relationship of what's happening in the soil 6 inches or 12 inches down is not. Tell me what you do.
I am an engineering geologist from northeast Pennsylvania out here in the Permian Basin.
Northeast Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Whereabouts?
Yeah, so anyway, Conestoga, but lived in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania on the Susquehanna River. Grew up next to a Superfund site. It's always interested me.
So it's another day in America.
So yeah, so Marcellus and Utica and all that good stuff in our special protected waters, and it's interesting to see what's beginning to happen out here.
One of the things that's happening around the country that will come to Texas eventually, because it's part of the Clean Water Act and it's part of the rules, is TMDL monitoring. We're going to end up with monitoring will be based not on a state permit, but it'll be based on the watershed that we live within. Done?
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, we're gonna